What can someone do today when they find themselves in the dark, facing unbearable pain and injustices that seem to have no explanation? It's a question with no easy answers, but one worth exploring, if only to search for a thread of meaning in the middle of chaos. This video aims to do just that by walking through the life and thought of someone who knew what hell was. What's about to be told is not just the story of a man who survived Auschwitz, but the story of an intellectual who chose to stare horror in the face and never looked away again. This is about Jean Améry, a man who dedicated his life to digging through the ruins of what it means to be human, trying to understand just how far a person can be broken without being killed. And even though his hell was unique, unrepeatable, carved into the systematic horror of the concentration camps, there's something terrifyingly universal in his story. The feeling of being abandoned by the world, the sense that the pain being endured is too much, too unjust, too absurd to be explained in words. There are people today who haven't known torture, but who live every day in a condition that feels like a sentence. People who wake up each morning under the weight of a suffering they didn't choose, didn't cause, and no longer know how to carry. A sick body, an unbearable loss, a depression that leaves nothing untouched, a past that won't let go, or a loneliness that can't even be put into words. Despair doesn't look the same for everyone, but those who've touched it know it can take endless forms. And in those moments, when it feels like the world has turned its back, when pain strips away the name and empties the identity, the questions that haunted Améry's mind are the same ones that still burn inside so many today. Where does dignity go when everything falls apart? What's left of a person when every point of reference has disappeared? That's why his thought doesn't belong only to the past. Even though it was born from history, it still speaks to the present, to those who feel erased, voiceless, without a place in the world, and are struggling to remain human in a world that often isn't. Jean Améry wasn't even his real name. He was born Hans Meyer in Vienna in 1912. Raised in an assimilated Jewish family, he was a cultured, refined intellectual, passionate about literature and philosophy. After the rise of Nazism, he fled to Belgium and joined the resistance. In 1943, he was arrested by the Gestapo, tortured in Fort Brandunk, and later deported to Auschwitz. He survived, but with wounds no liberation could heal. Torture for him was the beginning of the end, not of life, but of identity. At the end of the war, he chose to change his name, not to forget, but to mark a definitive break with the past. Hans Meyer was the name of the man he had been before the torture, before the camp, before the total loss of trust in the world. Jean Améry became the witness to that horror, the one who would dedicate the rest of his life to telling the untellable. Anyone who has been tortured can never again feel at home in the world, he wrote. Sadly, it wasn't a metaphor. The tortured body stops belonging to us. It becomes an object in someone else's hands. The experience of extreme pain erases any idea of inviolability. There's no longer a boundary between self and other, between right and wrong, between human and inhuman. Only one desperate urge remains, for it to end. But what makes Améry's account even more chilling is that dehumanization wasn't limited to the Nazis. Even among the prisoners, solidarity often collapsed. The camp reduced everyone to survivors fighting over the last piece of bread. One had to defend themselves even from their fellow prisoners, he explained. No one was themselves anymore. Everything was stripped away. Name, face, body, even mother tongue. Identity dissolved, and with it, trust in the world. This is one of the most powerful, harsh, and provocative ideas in Améry's thought. Trust in the world is a fragile assumption, one that can shatter in an instant. For him, The systematic violence of the camps had destroyed that trust. After Auschwitz, it was no longer possible to believe in a shared moral order, or in any restorative justice. One could no longer believe that human beings were inherently good or capable of empathy. The other, he said, can be hell. They can be the one who finds joy in destroying. That's why he strongly rejected the idea of the banality of evil proposed by Hannah Arendt. She had described Eichmann as a dull bureaucrat, incapable of deep thought, who simply followed orders without truly grasping the evil of his actions. But Améry couldn't accept this view. For someone who had seen the faces of executioners up close, evil was never banal. It was violent, conscious, and merciless. Eichmann, to him, was no mindless bureaucrat. He was a sadist, a man who knew exactly what he was doing. The problem wasn't shallowness, it was the malignant depth of certain choices. Evil is never banal. It always has a smell, a weight, an intensity. It can't be normalized, and it can't be explained away with sociological categories or historical justifications. It's the abyss, and it must be seen for what it is. Another core insight in Améry's work concerns the relationship between culture and barbarity. He was one of those intellectuals who arrived at Auschwitz carrying books and poetry. But in the camps, culture proved useless, even absurd. He recalled that during a forced march, a beloved poem came to mind, but the words felt hollow. How can poetry make sense when everything smells of smoke and ash? He realized that knowledge, philosophy, even beauty, had not been enough to stop evil. And maybe, in that context, they were useless. This didn't lead him to despise culture, but to put it on trial. Western thought, he said, had failed. The same European civilization that celebrated Plato, Goethe, and Beethoven was also the one that built the extermination camps. After Auschwitz, one had to think the unthinkable. That culture could coexist with crime, that the sun could shine while children were being hanged, that Schubert could play while bodies were being burned. Civilization was the disguise, not the antidote. And then there's the theme of suicide, which runs like a quiet shadow through all his work. Améry attempted to take his own life in 1974, but survived. He later wrote one of his most haunting essays, On Suicide, a Discourse, where he argued that ending one's life could be the final act of meaning in a world without meaning. For him, suicide wasn't something to condemn. It was an expression of freedom. It is man rebelling against the injustice of life, he said, a way to reclaim the body that had once been stolen from him. In 1978, Jean Améry ended his life in a hotel room, not because he had nothing left to say, but perhaps because he had already said it all. His testimony didn't seek reconciliation, nor did it offer a way out. His mission, as he put it, was to remember the irreconcilable, to keep the wound open so that no one could pretend it had healed. And that's where the power of his philosophy lies. No comforting messages, no redemption, just the raw truth of someone who saw the unbearable and chose never to look away. For Améry, memory was an act of justice, not consolation, a way to restore a voice to those who had been silenced. In the end, what remains is the challenge of not looking away, of refusing convenient interpretations, of accepting that the human can collapse and that vigilance is necessary. As he himself wrote, horror has not disappeared. It still moves among us with new faces, new names, and often we don't even notice. Resisting easy cynicism, ready-made solutions, and the urge to forget, this may be the most urgent lesson today. Because, as Primo Levi warned, it happened, therefore it can happen again. Is there still a way to keep one's humanity alive, even when everything seems lost? What can be done today to prevent anyone from being reduced to a thing again? And what can someone do today, living in darkness, weighed down by unbearable pain and injustice with no clear reason? When everything collapses and even the best intentions are no longer enough, the only possible salvation might just be to tell one's story, to write, to record, to speak into a microphone, because in that fragile act, there is already an act of resistance. Telling your story is a way to put the pieces back together, to remind yourself that, despite everything, you're still here. That pain didn't have the final word, and in the end, this might be the truest way to leave a mark. Every word written, every voice recorded, every thought shared becomes a trace that remains. And the more honest, deep, and lived that mark is, the more power it has to reach far, to travel through time, space, and maybe even solitude. Because there always comes a moment when that voice is heard by someone, and that's when something extraordinary can happen. Not feeling alone anymore, recognizing your own wound in someone else's, realizing suddenly that shared pain weighs a little less, or maybe even that your story becomes a shelter for someone else. Even in the depths of pain, that mark left on the world can build a connection, and that connection can change everything. Of course, it's not a cure that heals the pain, or an answer that solves everything, but it's a first step, a gesture that sparks a flame and opens up a space, and from there, with time, other ways can be found to search for meaning, even when everything seems to have lost it.